There is a particular kind of fear that does not shout. It moves quietly, like a shadow resting behind the ribs. It shows itself not in dramatic moments, but in small hesitations, the slight pause before answering a vulnerable question, the way the eyes drift away when someone looks too deeply, the soft smile used to cover a trembling truth. To be truly seen by someone you care about is one of the most intimate experiences a person can encounter. Yet it is also one of the most frightening, because being seen means being known, and being known means losing the protective distance that has kept the heart safe for so long. This documentary explores the quiet psychology behind that fear, where it begins, why it persists, and what it reveals about longing, connection, and the fragile hope of being understood. There is a moment small, almost unnoticeable, when the fear first makes itself known, a heartbeat too long before answering, a breath held for no clear reason, a sudden need to redirect the conversation, or to hide behind the familiar safety of humor, silence, or distance. For most people, these moments pass by without much thought, but for someone who fears being truly seen, they form a quiet pattern, a rhythm of subtle withdrawal, a practiced choreography of emotional retreat. This chapter begins in those everyday moments, because that is where the fear lives, not in dramatic confessions or life-changing events, but in the soft, delicate spaces between two people who care about each other. When someone you love asks a question that grazes the truth, "What's wrong? Are you okay? What are you feeling?" The fear doesn't respond with words, it responds with tension in the chest, with a perspective that suddenly narrows, with a familiar urge to protect yourself from exposure. To be seen means to be known, and to be known means losing the quiet defenses that have kept your inner world contained. Even if that containment has been lonely, predictable pain can feel safer than unpredictable openness. Recognition begins with noticing the contradiction inside, the desire to be understood, sitting right beside the instinct to pull away. Two emotional currents flowing in opposite directions, each with its own history. People who experience this fear often appear calm, introspective, even self-sufficient to others. Their emotional world is neat on the outside and complicated on the inside. They may come across as thoughtful listeners, careful observers, and gentle presences, not because they lack depth, but because depth has always felt like something that must stay hidden. There is a quiet irony to it. They long for intimacy, yet brace themselves against it. They crave connection, yet struggle in the moments when connection becomes possible. They want to be known, but fear what being known will reveal. This fear does not mean a lack of care. It often means the opposite. It means the heart has been shaped by experiences that taught it to move carefully, to avoid sudden closeness, to prepare for shifts in tone or intention. It means the person has learned to survive by being cautious with their truth. Recognition also involves noticing the masks that form over time, masks that appear as being the strong one who never falters, the quiet one who never burdens, the thoughtful one who always listens, the capable one who never asks for help, the present one who never reveals too much. These masks are not manipulative, they are protective. They block vulnerability long enough to keep the heart from becoming overwhelmed, but they also create distance, distance from others, and distance from oneself. To recognize the fear is to see how often this distance appears. The way you keep conversations on safe topics, the way you minimize your needs to avoid feeling exposed, the way you hesitate before sharing the parts of yourself that feel unfinished or uncertain. And still, beneath all of this, there is longing. Longing for someone to notice what you do not say. Longing for someone to understand you in the spaces where words feel fragile. Longing for someone to look at you and see more than what you manage on the surface. This contradiction, the pull toward closeness and the push away from being known, creates a quiet emotional tension that threads through relationships. Not loud, not dramatic, just present. A subtle ache beneath the interactions that matter most. Recognition is not about judgment. It is simply the beginning of awareness. A soft noticing of how this fear shapes behavior, emotion, and connection. Only by recognizing the fear can the deeper roots be explored. And only by seeing the patterns clearly can the story of why they exist begin to unfold. Fear does not begin in adulthood. It begins quietly, in the soft, impressionable years, when the world is first teaching a child what to expect from closeness. Long before a person knows how to name their emotions, they absorb patterns, tones of voice, moments of presence, moments of absence, experiences that whisper a simple message. This is how safe it is to be yourself. The early roots of guardedness are often subtle, not always dramatic, not always traumatic in the obvious sense. Sometimes the origins come from small inconsistencies, a warm parent who becomes distant when stressed, or a caregiver whose love feels unpredictable. Other times, the child grows up in a home where feelings are not dangerous, but simply invisible, unspoken, unacknowledged, left hanging in the air like unfinished sentences. Children learn from what is repeated, not from what is intended. And when emotional expression is met with dismissal, confusion, or conditional acceptance, something shifts inside them. The child begins to learn that parts of themselves are too much, too inconvenient, or too unclear for the people they depend on. So they adapt, quietly, naturally, instinctively. A child who senses that vulnerability may lead to discomfort learns to silence vulnerability. A child who sees their feelings overwhelm a parent learns to protect the parent instead of themselves. A child who grows up too fast learns self-sufficiency long before they learn self-expression. A child whose needs are inconsistently met learns to shrink the needs to minimize disappointment. These adaptations may look like resilience from the outside. They may even be praised. You're so mature for your age. You never cause trouble. You're easy to take care of. But inside, something quiet is forming, a belief that being fully seen is risky, that closeness requires caution, that love is something you must earn by being less of yourself. For many, the origins also lie in environments where emotions were not modeled. Parents who never showed vulnerability, even if they cared deeply. Homes where everything looked fine but felt emotionally distant. In those spaces, children do not learn the language of emotional availability. They learn silence. They learn observation. They learn to keep their inner world contained. And then there are the more tender, painful beginnings. The child who faced rejection when expressing hurt. The child who was told their feelings were dramatic, irrational, or unnecessary. The child who was scolded for crying, or ignored when asking for comfort. The child who reached out emotionally and felt the touch of indifference instead of warmth. In those moments, something essential in the child shifts. They stop reaching out, not because they don't feel, but because reaching out no longer feels safe. Guardedness is rarely a conscious decision. It's a survival instinct that forms before language, before self-awareness, before the ability to choose differently. It becomes the blueprint for how closeness is understood. A blueprint the child carries into adolescence, and eventually into adulthood. By the time they grow older, the habit of hiding has become second nature. They may not think of themselves as guarded. They may simply feel private, independent, or hard to read. But beneath those identities lies a deeper truth. They learned early on that the safest place to keep their emotions was inside. This chapter is not about assigning blame. It is about recognizing patterns that once protected a child who had limited choices. Patterns that helped them navigate emotional landscapes that felt uncertain or overwhelming. Patterns that made perfect sense at the time. But patterns formed in childhood do not disappear with age. They evolve. They travel. They follow the person into adult relationships, shaping how they connect, how they trust, and how they allow themselves to be seen. Understanding these origins is not an accusation against the past. It is a gentle acknowledgement that the fear of being truly seen began long before adulthood, long before romantic relationships, long before conscious defenses. It began with a child doing the best they could with the emotional environment they were given. And now, that early adaptation has become a central part of how the heart moves in the world. By adulthood, the fear of being seen no longer feels like a childhood adaptation. It feels like personality, like temperament, like something innate, rather than something learned. But beneath that sense of inevitability lies a series of psychological mechanisms, patterns, the mind and body rely on to create safety when vulnerability feels threatening. Self-protection is not a flaw, it is a system, a finely tuned, deeply intelligent response the nervous system learned long before the person could understand why. At the center of this system lies attachment, not in the romanticized sense, but in the quiet, biological reality that humans depend on relationships to survive. When early connections feel unpredictable, the brain learns to prepare for emotional instability. It becomes watchful, hyper-aware, skilled at noticing tiny shifts in tone, body language, and emotional atmosphere. This hypervigilance is rarely loud. It's subtle, a constant scanning for signs of disappointment or withdrawal, a sensitivity to emotional changes others barely notice. It is the mind trying to keep the heart from being caught off guard again. Then there is shame, not dramatic, overwhelming shame, but the quieter form, the sense that certain parts of oneself are unworthy of being seen. People who fear being known often carry implicit memories of moments when expression was met with confusion, judgment, or dismissal. Over time, the brain associates authenticity with exposure, and exposure with pain. So the psyche creates filters: say less, reveal less, expect less, feel less where others can see. This is not emotional coldness, it is emotional caution. It is the mind protecting the self from a wound it believes might reopen. Another layer of self-protection is emotional inhibition. The body learns to suppress physical signals of vulnerability: the trembling voice, the tightening throat, the warming eyes. These sensations are softened, muted, held down before they make it to the surface, not out of stoicism, but out of instinct. Neuroscience shows that the same brain regions that register physical danger are activated when emotional exposure feels risky. To the nervous system, being seen is not symbolic. It is literal. It triggers alarms rooted in early experiences. This explains why people who fear emotional visibility may struggle with intimacy even when they trust the other person. Trusting someone is not the same as feeling safe while exposed. The body can trust and still brace itself. In close relationships, this can appear as mixed signals: moments of openness followed by sudden withdrawal, warmth followed by distance, deep conversation followed by silence. It is not manipulation, it is regulation. The psyche opening just enough to feel connection, then closing to prevent vulnerability from becoming overwhelming. Another psychological element is the internal working model, the brain's quiet map of what closeness means. If early connection required you to hide, then hiding feels like love. If early connection required you to stay strong, then vulnerability feels like burden. If early connection felt inconsistent, then intimacy feels uncertain. These models are not chosen, they are inherited from experience. Self-protection also operates through narrative, the stories a person tells themselves about relationships. People don't stay. If I show too much, I'll be misunderstood. My feelings are too complicated for others. It's better not to need anyone. These narratives feel like truth, but they are reflections of old emotional environments. They are memories disguised as beliefs. Yet, despite all these layers of defense, the fear of being seen is rarely about others. It is about what visibility mirrors back, the unresolved parts of the self, the tender places still shaped by unmet needs, the emotions that never had the chance to be named. Self-protection is the psyche's attempt to guard these vulnerable pieces. But protection comes with a cost. It creates distance from the very closeness the heart quietly longs for. To understand this psychology is not to dismantle it. It is simply to see it clearly, to recognize that every withdrawal, every hesitation, every guarded moment is the result of a system built for survival, not for punishment, not for avoidance, and not for rejection. Self-protection is the language of a heart that learned to survive before it learned to be seen. There is a particular tension that lives inside people who fear being seen, a quiet, ongoing conflict that pulls them in two opposite directions at once. On one side is the longing for closeness, for someone to understand the textures of their inner world, to hold their truth gently, to meet them with warmth instead of distance. On the other side is the instinct to retreat, to hide, to protect themselves from the exposure that intimacy requires. This conflict is not loud, it is not chaotic. It rarely looks like dramatic push and pull. Instead, it shows up in subtler ways: a deep conversation interrupted by sudden silence, a moment of emotional honesty followed by withdrawal, a warm connection that becomes distant without explanation. The contradiction is confusing even to the person experiencing it. How can the same heart that longs for connection also fear it so deeply? How can someone crave emotional closeness, yet feel overwhelmed when it begins to form? The answer lies in the emotional history carried beneath the surface. The longing comes from the human desire to be understood, to feel safe in the presence of someone who sees beneath the surface. The fear comes from the memory of what happened the last time the heart was open. This inner conflict often creates emotional patterns that feel impossible to escape. Moments of openness feel hopeful, almost relieving, but immediately after, an echo of fear rises. Did I say too much? Did I reveal something I shouldn't? Will this change how they see me? The person might replay conversations in their mind, analyze the tone of their own voice, Wonder if the other person noticed the tremor of vulnerability they tried to hide. This self-monitoring does not come from insecurity alone, but from an internal rule created long ago. It is safer to be partially known than fully seen. As intimacy deepens, the fear intensifies. Even positive closeness can feel overwhelming because it threatens the stability of the emotional distance someone has relied on for years. Closeness means visibility. Visibility means exposure. Exposure means the risk of judgment, misunderstanding, or loss. But the longing never disappears. It sits quietly beneath the defenses. It rises in moments of connection, a shared laugh, a gentle gesture, a late-night conversation that feels easier than expected. These moments awaken an ache for something deeper, something real, something safe. Yet the moment the connection feels possible, the internal alarm sounds. The person may pull away emotionally, even if they stay physically present. They may change the subject, lighten the tone, or retreat into familiar silence. This is not disinterest, it is fear, a soft, instinctive bracing against potential hurt. The inner conflict also creates misinterpretations. A caring question might feel intrusive, a moment of intimacy might feel dangerous, genuine affection might feel too heavy to hold. The brain, shaped by experiences where vulnerability led to pain, struggles to trust what feels safe now. In relationships, this conflict can create confusion for both people involved. The guarded person may appear inconsistent, warm and open one day, distant the next, but inside, there is no inconsistency, only a continual negotiation between two deeply human desires, the desire to be known and the desire to be protected. Sometimes, the fear wins. Sometimes, the longing wins. Most of the time, they coexist, pulling the person into a delicate balance between reaching out and holding back. This chapter is not about resolving that conflict. It is about naming it, giving it shape, recognizing that this tension is not evidence of emotional weakness, but of emotional history. The inner conflict does not mean the person is incapable of connection. It means connection is meaningful enough to fear losing. It means being seen matters enough to protect oneself from it. It means the heart is still negotiating how much of itself it can safely reveal. Understanding this tension marks the point where avoidance stops being a mystery and becomes a story shaped by longing, fear, and the quiet hope that one day, the two might finally move in the same direction. Change, when it finally comes, does not announce itself. There is no dramatic breakthrough, no sweeping emotional revelation. Instead, the turning point arrives quietly, like a shift in the light, or the soft moment right before dawn when the world is still dark but undeniably changing. For someone who fears being truly seen, the turning point often begins in a moment so small it could be missed. A gentle look from someone they care about, an unexpected sense of safety in a conversation, a moment where their guard slips not because they forced it, but because something in the other person's presence felt steady enough to hold the truth. This chapter explores those delicate, almost imperceptible shifts, the ones that aren't dramatic, but meaningful, the ones that do not break the fear, but soften its edges. The turning point often begins when the cost of hiding becomes heavier than the risk of being seen. Not all at once, but gradually. Over time, the emotional effort of maintaining distance, the controlled responses, the careful conversations, the practiced calm starts to feel exhausting. And in that exhaustion, a quiet longing rises, the desire to rest, to exhale, to finally be understood without needing to hide. The turning point is not a decision. It is an ache, a recognition that the walls built for protection have also become a kind of solitude. It often happens in a moment where the person least expects it. Perhaps they share something small, an insecurity, a past memory, a piece of truth they usually keep hidden, and instead of judgment, they receive warmth. Instead of distance, they feel closeness. Instead of discomfort, they find relief. That relief is important. It is the body's first sign that vulnerability does not always lead to hurt. It is the nervous system learning, slowly and gently, that not all exposure is dangerous. Sometimes the turning point appears through contrast. The person realizes how deeply they care about someone, and suddenly hiding feels misaligned with the connection they hope to build. They notice how easily the other person shares their truth, and find themselves wanting to meet that openness, not with distance, but with presence. They see that the relationship remains soft, even when they reveal their imperfections. Other times, the turning point emerges from within, a memory resurfacing, a moment of emotional clarity, a sudden recognition that their younger self, the one who learned to hide, was trying to survive an environment that no longer exists. This shift is not loud, but it is profound. It feels like something inside loosening, like an internal fist, finally But even in this shift, fear does not disappear. It sits quietly beside the longing, still protective, still present. The person may open up slightly, and then retreat again. They may test the waters of vulnerability with small truths, watching carefully how the other person responds. They may feel both courageous and terrified at the same time. This is the nature of the turning point. It does not erase the past, it simply introduces a new possibility. A possibility that connection does not have to feel like a threat, that someone might actually hold their truth with gentleness, that being seen could be something other than exposure. It could be connection, it could be relief, it could be home. The turning point also involves recognizing that the fear itself is not a barrier to closeness, it is part of the story. It is proof of how deeply the person feels, how much they care, how much they have endured. In this light, the fear becomes softer, less like an enemy, and more like a familiar companion that is learning, slowly, to rest. This chapter marks the beginning of the inner shifter, quiet opening. A small breath of courage, a soft step toward allowing someone to see the parts of the self that have been hidden for so long. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to signal that the heart is ready to move in a direction it once feared. Toward closeness, toward truth, toward being seen. Authenticity does not arrive all at once. It emerges slowly, like a dawn that takes its time rising over the horizon. For someone who has spent years, sometimes decades, hiding behind emotional caution, the integration of authenticity is not a sudden transformation. It is a gradual unfolding, a quiet process of learning how to exist in relationships without shrinking or masking the deeper parts of the self. This chapter explores that slow integration, the moment when guardedness begins to soften into something more open, more grounded, more human. After the turning point, there is a subtle shift in how a person relates to their internal world. They start noticing their own reactions with more compassion and less urgency. Instead of immediately retreating when vulnerability arises, they pause, just long enough to consider another possibility, just long enough to feel the difference between old fear and present safety. Integration is not the absence of fear. It is moving with fear, instead of running from it, allowing it to be present in the room without letting it dictate every emotional choice. For many, the first signs of integration appear in small interactions, sharing a tiny truth that once felt too revealing, letting someone see a hint of sadness instead of covering it with a practiced smile, admitting confusion or uncertainty instead of pretending to be composed. These gestures may seem insignificant from the outside, but inside they carry weight. Every small expression is a quiet rebellion against the old belief that the inner world must stay hidden to stay safe. As authenticity integrates, the nervous system begins to learn something new. That connection can coexist with vulnerability. That closeness can develop without the threat of emotional harm. That someone can see the truth without turning away. This creates a gradual rewiring, a shift from emotional hypervigilance to emotional presence. The body no longer prepares for danger every time intimacy deepens. Instead, it begins to relax, to settle, to trust the environment one moment at a time. Authenticity also brings clarity. A person begins to understand the difference between hiding because they want privacy and hiding because they fear judgment. They learn to recognize when silence is protective and when it is restrictive, when distance is a boundary and when it is an echo of old wounds. This clarity creates room for choice, and choice is what transforms guardedness from an instinct into an option. Yet, integration is rarely linear. There are days when openness feels possible, and days when it feels overwhelming. Moments when sharing feels effortless, and moments when the old fear returns, tightening the chest, quickening the breath, reminding the person of all the times vulnerability felt unsafe. These regressions do not mean the person is failing. They mean the process is real. Authenticity is not a destination. It is a rhythm, a steady movement between openness and retreat, until the body learns that retreat is no longer the only form of protection. What helps this integration most is the presence of someone who responds to vulnerability with steadiness, not by demanding more openness, not by pressuring the guarded person to reveal themselves, but by offering a kind of emotional consistency that slowly teaches the psyche that it is safe to exist without armor. In relationships, authenticity begins to reshape the dynamic. Conversations feel more grounded. Moments of connection feel deeper, less fragile. There is more room for imperfection, more room for honesty, more room for the parts of the self that once felt too complicated to share. A person integrating authenticity begins to feel something they may not have felt in a long time, a sense of belonging that does not require performance or emotional containment. They start to understand that being seen is not the same as being judged, that being known is not the same as being exposed, that sharing truth does not lead to abandonment, but to a deeper kind of closeness that guardedness could never offer. Integration does not erase the past or rewrite the origins of the fear, but it creates a new present, one where the person can hold both their history and their hope, one where authenticity becomes less frightening and more like a quiet homecoming to themselves. In the end, the fear of being seen softens into something quieter, not because the fear disappears, but because it no longer holds the only truth. What once felt like a threat slowly begins to feel like an invitation, a gentle opening toward connection, toward presence, toward the possibility of being known without losing oneself. Many people spend years believing that closeness demands perfection, that to be loved, they must be composed, predictable, unaffected. But the beauty of being known is rooted in something far simpler, the soft, unpolished truth of being human. This chapter becomes the poetic exhale of the entire journey, the moment where the guarded heart recognizes that intimacy is not a performance but an experience, a slow intertwining of two emotional worlds, each revealing only what feels safe, each holding space for the opacity and transparency that exists in every real connection. Being known does not mean being fully understood at every moment. It means being met with warmth in the places where understanding is still growing. It means being held with patience in the corners of the self that are still learning how to emerge. It means the presence of someone who sees not only what is shared, but also what is struggled with, and stays anyway. One of the quiet truths of the human mind is that it longs to be witnessed, not in the spotlighted sense of attention, but in the softer form of emotional recognition. The feeling of someone saying, without words, "I see you." Not just the version you present, but the version you carry. There is something profoundly healing in that kind of presence. It settles the nervous system. It dissolves old tensions. It teaches the guarded heart that it does not need to hide to be held. When someone is truly known, the relationship shifts from fragile to resilient. There is more room for pauses, for uncertainty, for the imperfect rhythm of real life. There is less pressure to maintain the facade that used to feel necessary. Every small confession, every hesitant truth, every quiet revelation becomes a thread that strengthens the bond rather than threatens it. The beauty of being known is also the beauty of being accepted, not for performance, not for emotional compliance, but for authenticity. And acceptance is what nurtures the courage to remain open even when fear returns, because fear does return. It shows up in moments of vulnerability, in unexpected intimacy, in the sudden awareness that someone now has access to the deeper layers of the self. But instead of collapsing into retreat, the person begins to breathe, to remember that closeness and fear can coexist, that exposure is not the enemy, that the parts of them they once believed were too much or too complicated are merely human and capable of being met with understanding. Being known also brings a sense of peaceful grounding, a stillness that appears when the inner world no longer needs to be hidden behind rehearsed lines or guarded silences. The body moves differently when it is no longer bracing for rejection. The mind softens when it is not busy constructing protective layers around every emotion. Life feels less like a performance and more like a presence. There is beauty, too, in knowing someone else deeply, in witnessing their vulnerabilities, their fears, their long-held truths, in offering the same steadiness and acceptance that helped your own guardedness unravel. Closeness becomes reciprocal, not a demand, not a test, but a shared experience of unfolding. And perhaps this is the most profound part. To be known is not just to be seen, but to be cared for in the places where you once believed care was impossible. It is the quiet realization that connection does not ask you to become someone else. It simply asks you to arrive as you are. The beauty of being known lies in that gentle arrival, a return to your own truth, a softening into your own presence, a recognition that authenticity is not a risk but a relationship with yourself. And in that presence, the fear of being seen becomes something new, a testament to the courage it took to be known at all.